Ok. Evo, sve vas lijepo pozdravljam i zahvaljujem se na priključivanju i interesu za predavanja. Predavanja se dakle održavaju u sklopu izrade plana upravljanja starom gradskom jezgrom grada Splita i akcijskog plana upravljanja posjetiteljima, pri čemu nam je bilo jako važno naglasiti participativan pristup, što je onda i poticaj organizaciji ciklusa predavanja koje smo imali u utorak i ovog današnjeg predavanja. Što se tiče samog plana upravljanja, nositelj njegove izrade je grad Split, a plan se izrađuje u sklopu EU projekta Grad, života, Palača, mijena. Izrađivač plana je tvrtka Urbanex, iz koje smo ovdje danas kolega Mario Gregar i ja. Danas ćemo održati predavanje profesor sa Sveučilišta Complutense u Madridu, Sofía Mendoza de Miguel i Manuela de la Calle sa naslovom Regulacija kratkoročnog najma u kontekstu overtourisma, primjer povijesnih jezgri u Španjolskoj. Fokus ovoga predavanja bit će promjene u povijesnim jezgrama koje su uvjetovane prekomjernim turizmom, te će se predstaviti potencijalni načini kako se te prakse mogu regulirati, na primjeru povijesnih jezgri u Španjolskoj. We can repeat this introduction shortly in English. So online lectures are organized as a part of a management plan for World Heritage Property Historical Complex of Split with the Palace of Diocletian. Within management plan development process, it was important to have an extensive participatory approach, which is the reason for organizing this series of lectures. Sofía and Manuel accepted our proposal for cooperation and decided to organize a lecture with the title Short-Term Rental Regulations in the Context of Overtourism Applications in Spanish Historic Centers. And Sofía decided to be today's presenter, and we are very pleased to have her with us today. The main focus of this lecture is to present different forms of regulations of short-term rental based on zoning and limits of licenses, etc. That could serve as an example of good practice. Since we made this short introduction, Sofía, if you're ready, you can start with your presentation.
Thank you very much. I will try to share now the presentation.
Okay, great.
Is that okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Well, so thank you very much. I want to thank Urbanex and also the cities of Split for having me here. I hope this is somehow useful for your very interesting project. It is the management plan for UNESCO. So as Laura said, I'm going to base my presentation on this paper that we published, Manuel, Maria and I, we published a few years ago. And we conducted this research with the aim of studying the different short-term rental regulations that have been developed in a Spanish city for the past few years, but mostly before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 that stopped every regulation that was being developed. And aggravated by the spread of the certain rentals, both legal and illegal, the progress of overtourism affected historic centers of many cities. And in this context is when some Spanish local governments started to incorporate into their agenda this problem. So first of all, it's obvious that tourism brings a lot of benefits to the cities, mostly economic benefits, but it also brings some externalities, also economic impacts such as the rise of the life cost, but also noise pollution, overcrowding, loss of quality of life, and this all leads to the loss of cultural identity, to the loss of the lifestyles of the city center, which is also part of the heritage of these areas. Well, this is why it is very important for the local governments of Spain to incorporate into the agenda the controlling of the phenomenon and specifically certain rentals in order to safeguard the residential function of historic center. So before presenting the specific regulations that have been developed in some of the Spanish cities, I would like to present a little overview of how the administration works so you can understand how it is developed after the regulations. We have different tiers of government for accommodation regulations. Firstly, we have the national government, which it has a tendency law that explicitly excludes the short-term rentals any time of tourist accommodation for that matter. Hence, it is the regional government that is the first level of regulation of the tourist accommodation, and it regulates tourist accommodation as a economic activity. So it regulates the type of accommodations, where it's hostel, hotel, apartment, campsite, and the administrative registration system, inspection sanctions, and also other kind of characteristics that are dealing with the quality level, the service, the facility, and this kind of conditions that an establishment has to have. Meanwhile, we have a local level that regulates the tourist accommodation through through urban planning, which is probably the most restrictive level of tourist accommodation regulation. It treats the tourist accommodations as a tertiary land use, and it sees how it is compatible with other kind of land use, such as the residential land use. And it also develops some system of municipal license, some characteristics such as the access that the accommodation has to have, and also some zoning system. This approach was intended to regulate the use of hotels and other traditional tourist establishments, but with the sudden proliferation of short-term rentals, there was a new challenge in terms of planning, and it has driven very different response from the local governments. So before the outbreak of the COVID-19 epidemic, the debate of the regulation of this kind, the short-term rentals accommodations, was in full swing. And in general, we could distinguish three kinds of response from the local governments regarding their positions with the regulation. In those cities that has a city center that has something to do with World Heritage or historic site. So we have this first group where cities have rejected the option of regulation or have never even considered that option. We have those cities that the regulations are understudied or in an administrative process. But as I said, after the outbreak of the COVID-19, many of them have stopped. So only a couple of them, Cádiz, Sevilla, are still in the process, but it has been a long process now. And we have finally the cities with regulation that are the main focus of this presentation today. So the process for formulating these policies in Spain is a long one, and it can take several years. The first one is obviously the initial entry onto the agenda of the problem, when local governments become aware of the need for these regulations. After that, a study is commissioned at quantifying the supply of certain rentals and also assessing some of the measures that can be adopted in other destinations. And when the study is finally, here we have an example of the study of Valencia. When the study is finally published, then an expert committee is gathered, mostly led by the urban department of the city. But in theory, the idea is that other departments, such as the tourism department, can work with them in the committee. And they are responsible for preparing and submitting policy proposal for initial approval. After that, we have the new regulation that is definitely approved, but at some point between the first step and the fourth step, the last step, some of the governments decide to put a moratorium on new license for short-term rentals or other kind of accommodations as a precautionary measure. So before moving on to the cities with an actual regulation, Barcelona has always led the path in these kind of interventions, and other Spanish cities have followed it since the 1990s. It was in 2014 when the government of Barcelona started to draw up a special plan for regulation of short-term rentals, and they placed a moratorium on growth by suspending any award of this license for short-term rentals. But in 2015, the local government changed, and they went a step further, launching the preparation of approval of the special urban plan for tourist accommodation, which is the one in the image, and extending this moratorium not only for short-term rentals, but also for any kind of tourist accommodations, hotel, hostels, wherever. And it was finally approved in 2017. After that, many cities followed the lead, and in 2018, regulations were approved in Bilbao and San Sebastián, which are up in the north, Palma de Mallorca, Santiago de Compostela, which is west, and then we have in 2019 Madrid, Segovia, Pamplona, and finally in February of 2020, the lockdown in Spain started in March. The regulation in Barcelona, in Valencia, was finally approved. So the legal instruments applied in these 9 cities are very different. They have some common criteria, but even the document is a different one. We have some cities like Palma or Donostia San Sebastián that have decided to regulate this kind of accommodations through an ordinance. Palma, after that, incorporated the ordinance in the city plan. We have another cities like Bilbao, Pamplona, and Santiago that modified the planning regulations of tourist accommodations. Other cases like Segovia and Valencia, which are the most recent one, decided to regulate through a special plan of the historic center. And we have the most restrictive ones, that are the ones from Barcelona and Madrid, also the biggest cities in the country, that they draw up a specific plan specifically for regulate the licenses of use in the municipal area. The scope of the regulation is determined by the type of accommodation and the regulated content of the measures adopted. So we can see in the 4th column, some of them decided to regulate both short-term rentals and other kind of tourist accommodations, more traditional tourist accommodations, whilst others decided only to regulate short-term rentals. The regulation of room rentals is very rare. In general, it is only regulated by the regional government, the second administrative level, and mostly it is only prohibited. We have one case in Donostia that they decided to regulate the room rentals, but it only established some criteria for like the surface that it can have in the dwelling or this kind of criteria. A clear distinction is made between the residential use of the dwelling and the use of the tourist accommodation view as an economic activity equivalent to other type of accommodations that do not occupy the entire building. This distinction may be absolute or may consider the time. For example, the regulations in Madrid and Valencia only affect dwellings used as tourist accommodation for more than 90 days or 60 days. In such use is considered equivalent to any other type of accommodation activity. It can be totally forbidden, like in Santiago, or may be licensed in a building depending on a series of criteria. This criteria is the type of building. Palma only permits the short-term rentals in single-family dwellings. The access, the type of access may affect regulation, for example, whether it is independent access for a public road or access that involves using common spaces in a building with other residential dwellings. Thus, in cities like Madrid and Segovia, certain rentals are only permitted when there is an independent access, which mostly is a kind of provision forbidden of the certain rental. The position of the accommodation in the building, in general, tourist accommodations on the ground floor is permitted. Such spaces are usually all commercial establishments that have been converted into dwellings. And in some cases, restriction may be placed on new tourist accommodations located on the first floor or floors immediately below those used for the residential purposes. Most of this time appear in regulations like in Bilbao or in San Sebastián. And the number of software rentals and the surface area they occupy within a building. The regulation in Donostia, Bilbao, and Pamplona apply this criteria. For example, in Pamplona, a single building may not contain more than one tourist accommodation establishment, including room rentals. And the total surface of the area dedicated to this use may not exceed 200 square meters. So, in general, such regulation apply, and going back to this graph, in general, the regulations apply the practice of zoning. All studies today have found that tourism prison is uneven, tending to be more intense in particular areas of urban centers or significant heritage value that have been affected by an early shift to the service economy that threaten the status of as a residential space and which therefore requires preservation. Thus, the territorial strategy is to contain the growth of accommodation in these areas by implementing more restrictive measures, whilst being less restrictive in other areas that are less congested, less overcrowded, or less touristy. The idea behind this difference in regulation is to mitigate any risks to the recent success of the destination as a whole by indirectly encouraging the expansion of tourism activity in peripheral area. As we can see in the last column, the zoning system in some cities, in 3 of them, Barcelona, Donostia, San Sebastián, and Madrid, is explicit, whilst in most of them is implicit, and is one of them, they don't have any kind of zoning. So moving on to the zoning system. As on other occasions, Barcelona led the way in its spatial plan, and it divided the city in 4 zones. Zone 1, which is the red one, aimed at reducing accommodation capacity, forbidding the opening of new establishment, even if a previous accommodation establishment has shut down. We have the zone 2, which is the yellow one, that aims at maintaining the number of current establishment and beds. If an establishment closes, a new one in that case can open, but with the same amount of beds. In the zone 3, which is the green one up north, the objective is to contain growth, where new establishment may be open or existing ones extended. And in zone 4, which is the green one at the east, corresponding to the particular neighborhoods with a specific regulation. This zoning affects all types of accommodations, hotel, hostel, campsite, and in addition, the plan establishes 0 growth for certain rentals throughout the city, restricting new license in saturated areas to cases where a previous establishment of identical characteristic has closed. We have also the zoning in Madrid. It's very similar. It also divides the city in 4 parts that are concentric rings, and restrictions on transforming an entire building for use as tourist accommodation become more stringent towards the center. In fact, the regulation requires separate access for tourist accommodation, as I said before, only in the 2 central rings, which is the city center. In Donostia San Sebastián, there is 3 zones. we have the red zone that is darker, which has reached overcrowding point, and short-term rentals and room rentals are totally forbidden. And we have the light red zone where there is a high demand, but there is still some space for growth. And we have the zone 3, which is the white one, where license for few accommodations are possible. This regulation does not affect conventional type of tourist accommodations, only the short-term rentals, because the traditional tourist accommodations is governed by the provision of the city general plan. As noted, the most restrictive regulation corresponds to the historic synthesis of each city. The neighborhoods that are the pre-industrial city. In Barcelona, these are the zone 1, but it also spans some parts of the city that are not part of the city center, but they are very touristic and they have some problems of overtourism too. In Madrid, it's the Ring 1 and Ring 2. Ring 1 is the central district, and Ring 2 is this zone, both together is the zone declared at historic site. And in Donostia, the zone A, the darker red, is the old part, located within the old city walls of the city. In the rest of the city that have adopted regulations, however, zoning is merely explicit. In other words, the new regulations are established as special plans that only govern the historic center, which implies a differentiated, more restrictive approach with respect to the rest of the urban agglomeration. In general terms, this group of cities have moved towards a global policy of continuous tourism activity, but it is not limited only for the regulation of short-term rentals, but it's a big part of it. Some cities like Barcelona have also tried to limit cruise ships arrivals, and also tried to make a local surcharge of the regional tourism tax. Here we have also an administrative problem because the tourism tax in Spain is run by the regional government, so it's difficult to implement a local tourism tax. Also, Donostia, San Sebastian try to put a local tourism tax. Other cities like Madrid try to develop some promotion of the whole city. In Madrid, there is 21 districts, so they develop a plan called Madrid 21 districts, 21 destinations. And other cities like Santiago de Compostela, which is also quite popular, they try to promote less well-known heritage sites, and also varied the cultural events and activities that were being done in the city. All of this aimed at the decongestion, decentralization, deseasonalization, diversification, and raising awareness about the benefits of tourism, which are clear and are a lot, but also to the need to be respectful with the destination by the tourist. So if we go to some conclusions, the main weakness of this type of regulation is that it requires constant and difficult monitoring and control. It's not enough to have a regulation. It is important to be able to be sure that this regulation is being respected. And this is the part where most cities are failing, except from Barcelona. But even Barcelona, they have some people monitoring the respect of the new regulation, but it's not that easy. With this type of limitations, we could control problems of touristification, that we can avoid that the city centers start being some theme parks, but we don't avoid other problems like gentrification or access to housing that come from other urban processes. Also, the short-term rentals are not only the only type of accommodation that favors the touristification of historic centers. An excessive supply of hotels is also a problem in this area and brings a lot of tourists to live there. That's why many of the local governments have decided that whilst they were trying to regulate the certain rentals, it was a good opportunity to also regulate the traditional tourist accommodations. And also, less accommodation does not necessarily mean fewer tourists. The reality in the society that is so mobile and that the connections are getting better is that even if tourists allocate in a place outside the city center, they will always come to the city center to carry out the activity. So does this mean, I think, that the regulation of tourist accommodation is a waste of time? Absolutely not. But I think we have to have in mind what are our objectives and what are the solutions for each objective. So the regulation of tourist accommodation will not put an end of the overcrowding of the historic center, but it can control the touristification and will help to preserve the way of life of these spaces, which is an intangible heritage of enormous value for the tourist, social, urban attractiveness, etc. And finally, we should bear in mind that the regulation analyzed were drawn up in a context of overtourism, where the rapid proliferation of tourism activity has disrupted urban centers, and the outbreak of COVID-19 has halted the flow of tourism and suspended previous tourism programs. So many hotels projects have come to a standstill, and property owners are once again offering their dwellings for long-term residential rentals. I was last spring in Barcelona talking to one of the heads of tourism, and he said that they had an 80% occupancy of their legal tourist accommodation, but they had many hotels that have not retaken the activity to reopen their establishment after the COVID. So of course they had like a good deal of tourists, but it was not the same as before the COVID. So we cannot actually know the effectiveness of these regulations, but we do know that it is important to try to put a cap on the excessive growth, and it is important to control the overtourism phenomenon and protect the city center. And now I'm available for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofía. It was really interesting to hear about the experiences that you have shared. That could certainly be very useful for the current situation in Split, which deals with the consequences of overtourism. Are there any questions from the audience, maybe? No? Okay. Maybe just to start a brief discussion, I would like to ask you, what were the citizens' reactions to the regulations that you have mentioned? Were there any resistance towards these regulations, and how long it took for citizens to accept them?
Well, I don't think it took them a lot of time to accept it, because mostly it was the own citizens asking for this kind of regulations. Even in some very touristic municipalities where citizens were taking profit of this new model of activity, they will say that it's good, but it has to be regulated somehow so it doesn't ruin our city. But even though citizens wasn't the great oppositors against this regulation, there was a great opposition from the hotels associations and certain rentals associations, mostly hotels associations, because they were asking for this kind of regulation of certain rentals, And when it came time for the regulation, they realized, oh, they are regulating also our activity, putting more caps into our activity. So they, in many cities, they even took this kind of plans and ordinance and laws to the court. And some of the regulations are still in court, and some of them won, like Barcelona. It was taken to court and they won. But in other cities, the hotel associations and social renters association won, and the regulation could not be developed.
Thank you. If there are any more questions, maybe as a conclusion, could you give some kind of advice for cities that also encounter with these problems of overtourism, how to find a balance?
Well, to find a balance, that's how my whole research is about this, and I haven't come to a proper conclusion yet. But I think that the thing that I see in some cities that are working very well and in others that are not working that well is that it is important to approach this phenomenon from the city perspective. It is a city problem and tourism is a part of it. It's not, I don't know in other countries, but in Spain, the tourism department doesn't have the capacity to deal with the problem. That's why, for instance, these regulations always come from the urban department. The case of Amsterdam, I don't know if you know it, probably you do, that they have developed the project City in Balance, which is only for the city center of the city of Amsterdam. And in that project, all the departments, tourism, urban, security, waste department, they all work together, mobility, to try to manage the city and manage the impacts of tourism within all the departments of the city.
Thank you. Well, maybe this cooperation could be the key. We will now close the lecture in Croatian.
Sorry, we have one question in chat.
Okay. Sofía, can you see the question?
I can read it.
Okay.
Which city was most successful in regulations?
Well, I think the most successful in Spain is Barcelona, because they were the first one and they had already, before this new regulation, a pretty restrictive regulation, and also because they are taking action into the controlling that the regulation is respected. Not only having the regulation as we do have the document, but also trying to control after that. But if we think international, I think the case of Amsterdam is very interesting because they have been making deals with Airbnb. So that is the point where our cities are still behind. We have to make sure that Airbnb, HomeAway, all these kind of websites also ask for the license, the municipal license to the people that is announcing their accommodations in the website, in the platform.
Was this some kind of in some way related to Airbnb platform, or?
Yeah, Airbnb always is working with the local governments, and they try to ask always for legal accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to take in mind that obviously both illegal accommodation is worse because they are avoiding paying taxes and wherever. But legal accommodation is also a problem, not because it's legal. It's not a problem. If we have a lot of short-term rentals that are illegal, we are creating an overcrowding in the city center. And a problem that we have in Madrid, that is a huge one, is that some companies are buying whole buildings and transforming every apartment that is usually for residential use into certain rentals. And they can be illegal because they had got the license for that. But if at the end, the city center is full of these buildings that are not anymore for residential use, but for certain rentals, that is a problem.
Thank you. And here is one more question. Which stakeholder is the key leader for regulations?
I will always say is the local government, because they have the administrative abilities to take the regulations. But in the case of short-term rentals, more specifically, is the urban regulation in the Spanish cases, because they are the ones that can be more restrictive. As I explained at the beginning, the regional government, they do have these regulations, but they only regulate the economic activity. They don't actually regulate, they cannot actually forbid that a new short-term rental is put in a building. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answers and for your presentation, of course. We can then conclude the lecture in Croatian. Evo, zahvaljujemo se svima na sudjelovanju i pozivamo vas da ispunite anketu o životu i izazovima na području stare gradske jezgre. Link će biti u chatu, a zapravo će nam rezultati pomoći u unapređenju plana upravljanja. Također pozvali bismo sve i na predavanje uživo koje će biti vezano uz održavanje i obnovu stambenih prostora u jezgri koje će se održati 10.11. Tako da ako ima zainteresiranih, slobodno nam ostavite kontakt u chatu pa ćemo vam proslijediti poziv. Tako da evo, hvala svima još jednom i lijep pozdrav. Eto. Thank you, Sofía. Teo, ćete vi još nešto?
Just wanted to say thank you to Sofía for her time and telling us their experience.
No, thank you very much. You all have my email, so if you want to dig deeper in any of these themes, just please mail me. I think this is a very interesting project and well, happy to help.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Adios.
Adios.